Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath the Spire. Dawn Spire rose like a lance of silvered stone above the city of Hargendorf, its towering belfries etched with the sacred runes of Sigmar. Light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the marble floors with scenes of divine judgment and celestial wrath. The air hung heavy with incense and righteousness, a perfume of burnt myrrh, holy oils, and the quiet whispers of prayer. But beneath the marble skin of the temple, in the guts of its ancient crypts, where candlelight failed and sanctity gave way to silence, something else stirred. The crypt's stone door groaned as it opened, not with the ceremonial reverence of a burial rite, but with the slow, furtive care of trespass. A figure slipped through the gap, robed in tattered black. His face was obscured by a cowl, but his hands, pale, claw-like things, carried a heavy sack, slick with dampness. He knelt before an old burial niche and began his work. From the sack came the sound of bone scraping bone. A severed hand, still wearing the silver ring of a lector of Sigmar, thudded wetly onto the stone floor. Then came the priest's eyes, gouged from their sockets and threaded together with sinew. Lastly, a human heart, still faintly twitching. The figure set them into a crude triangle and began to chant. The air trembled, thickened, candles guttered, shadows twisted. A voice not heard but felt like teeth grinding against the soul answered the prayer. Flesh for hope, blood for order, heart for faith. The figure bowed his head, forehead pressed to the blood-slick floor. When he looked up, his eyes burned with an inner crimson light. He was no longer alone. Behind him, in the crypt's darkness, more shapes emerged, robed and hooded. Some whispered blasphemies, others merely watched, eyes gleaming with fervor. Their leader turned to them, and when he spoke, his voice was a rasp soaked in reverence and wrought. "Varric speaks," one of the cultists whispered. Varric the Whisperer, prophet of the hidden gods, opened his arms wide as if to embrace the catacombs themselves. "The walls tremble with the breath of the Four," he murmured. "This place, this golden nest of Sigmar's carrion priests, shall rot from the root. We will supplant their relics, desecrate their altars, and when the light dies, the dark shall feast." The cultists bowed, fists pressed to their chests. One raised a scroll, scratched with profane sigils in a mixture of blood and bile, and unrolled it before Varric. "We begin with the hammer," the prophet intoned. "Corrupt it, mask it. Let it sing with lies while they lift it in prayer." He reached into the sack again and withdrew a lump of flesh stitched with runes. It pulsed, throbbed like a tumor in a womb. Varric handed it to one of the cultists. "You have until the next bell tolls. Fail, and your skin shall write the next verse of my gospel." The cultist trembled, bowed, and ran. Above them, life continued unaware. Ding! The bell atop Dawnspire rang out across Hargendorf. In the main sanctuary the faithful gathered, heads bowed. Priests in radiant white robes chanted litanies of purity and strength. Incense wafted skyward in curling tendrils. The morning sermon had begun. Ellen Falkenberg, novitiate priestess, stood near the altar, arms raised in solemn gesture. Her eyes flicked over the crowd, 1,000 souls, their gazes heavy with trust. Yet her guts squirmed with unease, not because of the crowd, but because of a sound she'd heard an hour ago beneath the temple. Something like stone grinding on stone, just for a moment, then gone. And now, as the hammer of judgment was brought forth, its head shimmering with sacred gold, its haft engraved with the names of martyred saints, Ellen saw something no one else did. A flicker of darkness, like oil spreading across the relic's surface. She blinked, gone. She turned her gaze away, dismissed it. Perhaps It was her imagination. But beneath the sanctuary, in the crypts choked with rot and whispers, Verax smiled. The first shadow had been cast, and the dawn would never look the same again. Chapter 2. The Unseen Hand. The city of Hagendorf breathed with the pulse of imperial routine. Wagons rattling on cobbled roads, steam rising from smithies, and hawkers crying out their wares with the guttural cadence of middenland accents. But inside the hallowed halls of Dawnspire, the air was still and heavy, as though the temple itself were holding its breath. In the outer cloisters under high-arched ceilings carved with the triumphs of Sigmar, novices swept flagstone floors and polished golden sconces. One of them, tall, bald, and with the vacant gaze of devotion, paused beneath a statue of Galmar Heldenlicht, first defender of the Empire. He knelt with reverence, kissed the base, and whispered a prayer. But as his lips brushed the stone, his tongue darted out, a slick, inhuman thing, and left behind a smear of dark fluid that sank into the marble like oil through paper. The novice stood, smiled beatifically, and continued his work. Elsewhere, Ellen Falkenberg moved through the armory hall, her fingers grazing the hafts of ceremonial weapons that lined the walls, hammers, axes, swords, each gleaming with centuries of anointment. The unease that had taken root in her during the morning's sermon hadn't passed. If anything, it had grown deeper, more insistent, like a whisper in her mind she couldn't shake. She approached the reliquary vault, where only the sanctified were allowed to tread without escort. Her key, marked with the seal of the high priest, turned smoothly in the lock. She stepped inside. The chamber smelled of wax and sanctity. Candles flickered around the reliquary stands, and the air shimmered faintly with holy wards. There, in a pedestal of polished obsidian, lay the hammer of judgment. But something was wrong. Ellen's eyes narrowed. The hammerhead was duller than it had been at dawn. Not rusted. No, rust had no place here, but the purity of its aura was tainted, like gold tarnished with shadow. She stepped closer, hesitant. Then the candlelight warped. Shadows curled around her feet, dancing like grasping fingers. A low hum began. No, a vibration, like the air itself was chanting in a voice without sound. "Who dares?" she whispered, reaching for her sanctified dagger. Then the vision struck her. The chamber bled away, replaced by screaming black. In that void she saw the hammer again, but it wasn't a weapon, it was a beacon. A lighthouse summoning a tide of things with too many eyes and not enough skin. Creatures laughed in voices that split the sky like thunder made of bone, and beneath them, Dawnspire burned. Ellen fell back, gasping, her head pounding. She scrambled from the chamber, slamming the door shut behind her. Across the temple, in the kitchens, another infiltration was underway. A young scullion named Wulfric, a recent convert and supposedly mute, dragged a sack of turnips into the pantry. But the sack squirmed. Inside were 3 newborn rats, each stitched together with thread and blessed with slivers of warped jade. As Wulfric scattered them across the pantry floor, he whispered in dark-tongued lips barely moving. The rats twitched, then began to grow, flesh bubbling, bones snapping into elongated forms, mouths opening too wide for their skulls. Moments later, screaming erupted from the kitchens. When guards burst in, they found Sister Adina dead, her throat gouged out and her eyes gnawed from their sockets. The walls were clawed in mad spirals, and blood soaked the floor. The rats were gone. Wulfric was gone. Captain Marcus Velt, a grizzled temple warden with a silver-plated pauldron and a sword that had once killed a beastman chieftain in one blow, arrived moments later. He stared at the mess, jaw clenched. "This wasn't animal work," he muttered. Ellen appeared at his side, her face pale. "I need to speak with you," she said, "privately." They moved into the chapel vestry. Ellen wasted no time. "I think the hammer is corrupted." Marcus stared at her. "Corrupted? That's a relic of Sigmar himself." "I had a vision. And the aura's changed. It's subtle, but it's real." Marcus scratched his jaw, the scars on his cheek catching the light. "You're not the only one seeing things. Rats that vanish, novices that don't sweat. Cook says someone's been whispering prayers backwards. And now this." He jerked a thumb back toward the kitchen, where Sister Adina's body was still being covered with a sheet. "Something's crawling inside our temple," he said grimly. "Something we can't see." Ellen met his eyes. "Then we need to see it." From the shadows, unseen even by Sigmar's light, Verax the Whisperer watched through a scrying crystal fashioned from a daemon's tooth. He smiled. The trap was set. The hunt had begun. Chapter 3. Eyes of Sigmar. Midnight at Dawnspire was a silence so profound it suffocated the soul. The moon hung swollen and blood-tinged over Hargendorf, its light struggling to pierce the temple's towering spires, narrow windows. Candlelight guttered behind stained glass. Ellen Falkenberg moved through the chapel alone, a lantern in one hand and her dagger, a blessed blade of tempered silver, in the other. Every step echoed too loudly, each footfall a pulse in a dead man's chest. Her nerves burned. She had decided there would be no sleep tonight. The vision still clung to her skin like frostbite. She moved past the main altar where the hammer of judgment lay beneath embroidered velvet and descended the stairs toward the lower levels of the temple. The crypts waited below, old bones, older secrets. She passed through the Hall of Saints, where the bones of martyred heroes were entombed in glass-fronted sarcophagi. Dozens of skulls stared at her through gilded latticework, each marked with a symbol of Sigmar, each filled with silent judgment. She paused before the final descent, a cold spiral staircase hewn from ancient stone, its walls slick with the breath of the earth. The sound froze her mid-step. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It echoed up the stairs, not hurried like a rat's scamper, but deliberate, clawed, as though something were carving its presence into the very stone. Ellen lowered her lantern and crept down. Each step was a prayer, each breath a gamble. She reached the crypt threshold and stopped. The air was wrong. It smelled of copper, incense, and rot. The vault doors were ajar. The protective runes inscribed along the iron frame had been smeared with black ichor. The holy seal of Sigmar, usually bright with warding light, was cracked. Inside she heard a voice. "From the bone of the faithful shall grow the tongue of blasphemy." She edged the door wider and peered in. What she saw chilled her marrow. 3 robed figures knelt before a cracked statue of Sigmar. They were naked from the waist up, their backs flayed in ritual strips, revealing twitching muscle and pulsing veins. Carved into their skin were symbols, swirling, alien, alive. One of them was slowly driving nails through his own hands into the stone floor, each strike a stifled scream. A fourth stood at the altar. Verax. He held aloft a chalice brimming with something thick and black that smoked as if boiling. A sliver of light caught his face, revealing skin too smooth, too taut, as if stretched over something inhuman beneath. His eyes were hollow, not blind, but empty, void-filled. "We bleed for the new age," Vanax intoned. "We stain the bones of this corpse god with the truth of chaos. Sigmar will scream in our choir." The acolytes responded in perfect unison, their voices reverent and raw. Blood for ruin. Bone for truth. Flesh for the new dawn. Helene did not scream. She backed away slowly, careful, silent, and turned. right into something solid. A hand gripped her neck. The novice from the cloister? The tall one with the vacant eyes. Only now his eyes weren't vacant. They were glowing red, his pupils twin pinpricks of malevolence. He lifted her with unnatural strength and slammed her against the wall, the air exploding from her lungs in a choked gasp. Her dagger dropped, skittering across the stone. He leaned in, breath sour with blood and bile. "I see you," he hissed. "The eyes of Sigmar have gone blind, priestess." Ellen kneed him in the gut. Then she reached into her robe and pulled a vial, the last of her consecrated oil. She smashed it into his face. The glass burst. The oil ignited on contact with unholy flesh. The cultist screamed, no, shrieked, his voice cracking into unnatural registers as flames devoured his skin. Smoke filled the corridor, and Ellen dropped to the ground, scrambling for her blade. She snatched it up and fled. Behind her, the cultist writhed in fire, his skin bubbling, boiling. He clawed at the walls until his fingers left strips of flesh, and when he finally collapsed, twitching and smoking, he laughed. A low, gurgling laugh that echoed through the crypt. Aelin didn't stop until she reached Marcus Velt's chamber. She burst in, bloody and breathless. The captain rose from his bunk, sword half drawn, eyes wide. Had the hammer what? "They're inside, Marcus," she gasped. "The cult, the relics, they're already turning them. Sigmar's light is fading." Marcus stared at her, then at the blackened scorch marks on her sleeve, and he nodded. "Then we cut out the rot." He picked up his blade, and the war for Dawnspire truly began. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Catacombs. The storm broke just after the third bell. Rain lashed the slanted rooftops of Hagendorf, sluicing through alleyways and hammering against the stonework of Dawnspire like the fury of a forgotten god. Thunder bellowed above, drowning the cries that rose from the undercroft of the temple. But inside, far beneath the sanctified bell towers, the silence had grown cancerous. Helene Falkenberg descended once more into the bowels of the crypt, now flanked by Captain Marcus Velt and two of his most trusted wardens, Brother Halbrecht and Sister Isolde. Each carried a lantern and steel weapon, blessed in the forge fire of the temple's relic smithy. Their breaths fogged in the cold. "This is where I saw them," Aelin whispered, voice tight as a drawn bowstring. "Beyond the ossuary, past the veiled arch." They moved in formation, Velt at the front, Ellen behind him, Halbrecht and Isolde guarding the rear. The walls closed around them, the air thick with mildew, rot, and something else, something acrid and metallic. The group halted at the veiled arch. The passage beyond, it had changed. Where once there had been sealed alcoves holding dust-choked reliquaries now gaped hollowed recesses. Bones were gone, replaced by piles of skinless rats strung together with twine and entrails. Their eyes, too many eyes, blinked slowly in the gloom, watching. Halbrecht gagged, nearly dropped his lantern. "Sigmar preserve us." They stepped over the vile constructs and moved deeper. The corridor narrowed, choked with smoke from unseen fires, and there, etched into the floor in black ichor, was a rune. Helene knelt. It was a spiral, but not a simple one. It wound impossibly inward, deeper than it should have, as if looking at it pulled her mind into a hole too narrow to escape. Whispers scratched at the edge of her hearing. She stood quickly. "We're being watched." Isolde nodded grimly. "Let them watch. We're not here to hide." As if in response, the ground trembled. Stone cracked open just ahead, and something rose from the darkness. A shape once human dragged itself into view. Robed in temple vestments, its head was twisted backward on its neck, jaw unhinged, eyes missing. From its open mouth a serpent of fused tongues slithered, pulsing and glistening. The thing croaked in two voices. Clarence waits in the marrow, beneath the dawn. Velt didn't hesitate. He swung his blade, cleaving the abomination in half. The creature shrieked, a sound that split the lantern light and made the walls weep blood. It writhed on the floor, bones cracking as it tried to pull itself back together. Isolde stepped in, smashing its skull underfoot with her mace. A wet crunch. Silence. They pressed on. They reached the inner catacombs, an antechamber ringed by broken statues of saints. But the statues had been defiled, heads replaced with animal skulls, eyes gouged. One had been turned upside down and its mouth stuffed with teeth. In the center of the chamber, a pedestal rose. On it, a relic. The shroud of St. Arden. Once a thing of glory, woven from phoenix feathers and blessed thread. Now it was blackened, smoldering, its weave crawling with maggots. Varrix's voice echoed from the darkness. "You're too late, Lightborn. Your saints rot in their glass coffins. Your relics weep poison. Your god is silent." Lanterns flickered. Shadows twisted, swarming around the room like flies. Then the cult struck. From the walls and cracks they came, robed figures, faces painted with blood and ash. One hurled a censer filled with screaming insects. Another drew a blade of obsidian inscribed with demonic scripture. Halbrecht took the first hit. A cultist buried a spike in his throat. Blood sprayed across the pedestal. He gurgled, fell, and the shadows seemed to devour his body whole. Isolde roared, hammer raised. She crushed a skull with one swing, caved in a ribcage with a second, but she was bleeding. A deep gash down her side from an unseen blade. Velt fought like a beast cornered. His sword moved with brutal grace, severing limbs, splitting torsos. One cultist lunged, and he caught her throat mid-leap, driving his pommel into her windpipe with a wet crack. Alan backed to the wall, fending off a snarling woman with broken glass sewn into her fingers. The dagger in Alan's hand sang as it struck, slicing through the wrist, sending bloody shards flying. Then she felt it, a presence behind her. She turned, and Varrix stood there. His robes moved like liquid shadow, his skin writhing with invisible insects. His smile was not human. "You carry the light, little priestess," he said softly. "Let me show you the truth behind it." He raised his hand. Elin screamed as her lantern burst, not with fire, but with darkness. A wave of void poured from it, snuffing out light, hope, sound. Her ears rang. Her mind reeled. But Marcus was there. He drove his blade into Varrix's chest with a savage roar. There was a hiss, like boiling oil hitting cold flesh. Varrix's body convulsed, but did not fall. He grinned. "You think this is flesh?" he whispered. "This is a doorway." The blade was flung from Velt's hand by an unseen force. He slammed into a wall, cracking stone, and slumped. The shadows surged again, but this time Ellen raised her dagger and began to chant. Old words, forbidden words, taught to her in secret by an old priest who feared such a day might come. Light erupted from the blade. Holy, blinding. The shadow screamed and pulled away. Varrix hissed and vanished into smoke. The cultists fell back, burning where the light touched them. Silence returned, but only for a moment. Isolde knelt by Halbrecht's body, weeping. Ellen helped Marcus to his feet. Blood ran from his temple. "Is it over?" he rasped. Ellen shook her head, eyes burning with fury and dread. "No," she said. "It's just beginning." Chapter 5. The First Desecration. The next morning broke with a sky the color of old bruises, heavy with clouds that didn't rain but only threatened, as though even the heavens were holding their breath. The bell of Dawnspire tolled hollow and distant, its sacred clangor thudding with no echo, deadened, muffled. as if the air itself had grown too thick for prayer to pass through. High above the city, in the reliquary hall where gold filigree kissed ivory pillars and angels of marble stood in ranks, the hammer of judgment lay upon its ceremonial plinth. It gleamed with muted light, but to the faithful gathered for the morning rites, it still shone with the promise of Sigmar's strength. To Ellen Falkenberg, it was something else entirely. She stood at the back of the procession hall, her robes spattered from the night's horrors, cleaned as best they could be, but still marked. She hadn't slept. The image of Varax, of Halbrecht's dying gurgle, of the desecrated relics in the catacombs, they had scorched themselves into the back of her eyelids. She wasn't here to pray. She was here to watch. As High Priest Aurelian approached the hammer to begin the blessing, Ellen stepped closer, eyes scanning every inch of the ancient weapon. Its haft, once etched with gleaming silver scripture, was now a dull pewter. The runes, if one looked closely, had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, like letters just slightly wrong. Bent, shifted, reversed, twisted. And worse than the sight was the feeling. It no longer radiated warmth. It pulsed, like something alive, like something hungry. Aurelian lifted the hammer before the assembly. His voice rose in hymn, echoing through the vault with ritualistic cadence. By Sigmar's light and hand, may the strength of this relic. The relic screamed. A sound tore through the chamber, high, shrieking, not from Aurelian's lips, but from the hammer itself. The tone was discordant, metallic, and maddening. Glass shattered. Several novices collapsed to the floor, clutching their ears, blood pouring from their nostrils. Then the hammer moved, not by Aurelian's hand. It twitched. The high priest gasped as the relic surged upward with unnatural force, yanking his arms skyward. Muscles tore. He screamed as bones snapped in his shoulders, his hands still fused to the handle. The hammer rose above his head, lifted not by faith but by possession, and then it brought itself down onto his skull. A sickening crack. Aurelian's head burst like fruit struck with a war maul. His body crumpled to the floor, arms still raised as though crucified by his own strength. Blood sprayed across the altar, the saints, the worshippers. Panic erupted, screaming, stampeding. The faithful scrambled from the hall, trampling one another, some clawing at their own faces as whispers bloomed in their minds from that single cursed scream. A few remained, paralyzed with awe or horror, or something darker still. One old woman wept, not in sorrow, but in ecstasy, her fingers twitching in sigils not taught by the temple. Ellen charged forward. Marcus Velt was already on the scene, bloodied sword drawn, cutting a path through the chaos. Isolde trailed behind, clutching a splintered shield. They met at the altar. The hammer now hovered in the air, spinning slowly. Blood dripped from its edge, not just Aurelian's, but something thicker, oily, black. Marcus flung his sword. The blade struck true, embedding into the haft. The hammer shuddered, shrieked again, but dropped, clanged to the stone floor like a corpse hitting the ground. Still now, silent. Isolde knelt beside Aurelian's mangled remains, bile rising in her throat. "Sigmar," she whispered. "He was our voice." "No," Aelin said, voice iron cold. "He was the first casualty." She turned to the relic, now still, and stepped toward it. "Help me bind it," she said. "Holy wrappings, salt, blessed wax, and warding chains. I don't care if it takes 100 links." Marcus frowned. "Shouldn't we destroy it?" Ellen met his eyes. "If we destroy it, whatever's inside might not die. It might escape." She leaned in close to the weapon. "And I want to know what it's waiting for." Far below, beneath stone and sacred scripture, Varax knelt in a pool of sacrificial blood. The ritual had been successful. A relic desecrated, a soul consumed, a relic repurposed. The Whisperer smiled and dipped his fingers into a chalice of black sap, drawn from a withered tree that had once stood in a battlefield soaked with martyrs' blood. He painted a symbol on the floor, a circle within a hand, within a spiral. "Settle down," he whispered. 8 to go. Chapter 6. Sermons of Blight. The chapel of Dawnspire had never known silence like this. Its vaulted ceilings, once resonant with hymns of divine fury, now loomed above a congregation hushed by fear. Incense no longer drifted sweet and light. Instead, it clung to the rafters like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick with clove, ash, and rot. High Priest Aurelian's body had been removed. It scrubbed, sanctified, yet his blood refused to be forgotten. No matter how many prayers were chanted, how many blessings cast, the altar stone bore a stain that would not lift. Black veins ran from it now, like rot in marble, creeping across the steps where the hammer of judgment had cracked bone and belief alike. Ellen Falkenberg stood at the edge of the congregation, watching. The hall was filled, yet no one breathed easily. Every motion was stiff, every whispered prayer laced with suspicion. Heads turned too quickly, eyes lingered too long. The air tasted of sweat and secrets. And then the new voice rose. Brothers, sisters, sons and daughters of Sigmar. Ellen's blood chilled. She knew that voice. Brother Tolland, once a quiet, devoted scholar of scripture, now stood at the pulpit, draped in the high priest's stolen vestments. They did not fit him. They hung wrong, bulging over his frame as though the cloth resisted his touch. His eyes were too wide, his smile too steady. He began to preach. Sigmar, in his infinite wisdom, has chosen this moment to test our faith, not to punish, but to prepare. For within every rot lies a seed, and from that seed, new life. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some heads bowed, others snapped up, startled. Ellen narrowed her eyes. That was not canon. Tolland's hands rested on the altar, just over the still dark stain. "Consider the flesh," he said, voice rising. "It must break to mend, bone must crack to regrow. So too must our faith be remade, not in denial of darkness, but through it." A few people gasped. A child began to cry. Still, no one moved. Tolland's voice dropped, more intimate now, seductive, infectious. The gods of ruin, our enemies, yes, but also our mirror. Their strength lies not in deception, but revelation. They strip the veil. They show the truth of what we are beneath this skin of law and lie. Helen couldn't take it any more. She pushed through the pews and stormed the dais. "Tolland!" she barked, dagger at her side, hand clenched around a small phial of sanctified salt. "Step away from the altar!" Gasps. Screams. Tolland turned to her, his smile widening, stretching until the skin at his cheeks cracked. "My dear Sister Falkenberg," he purred, his voice no longer entirely his own. "You should rejoice. You are witnessing the first true sermon in 1,000 years." He extended his hand. His fingers were wrong, longer, twisting. Bones warped under skin that shimmered like slick fungus. A novice bolted for the exit. Tolland's eyes snapped toward the boy, and with a flick of his hand, the altar stone burst. Shards of holy granite launched across the chamber, cutting flesh and splitting faces. The novice's legs were shorn clean off, his torso flung into a pillar with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed the air like paint on canvas. Panic surged. Tolland began to laugh. The sound echoed, not from his mouth, but from every wall, every shadow, every flickering torch. Helen flung the phial. It shattered at his feet, and where the salt touched him, his flesh boiled. He screamed, his true voice high, brittle, terrified, emerging for a moment beneath the corruption. Marcus Velt arrived through the side entrance, sword already red from another skirmish in the western wing. He dove into the fray, cutting through a cultist who had disguised herself as a nun. Her blood sprayed in arcs as her throat opened wide beneath his blade. Tollin stumbled back, clutching his melting arm. "You blind fools," he howled. "You worship a corpse, a frozen fist in the sky." Helen leapt onto the altar. With a cry to Sigmar, she drove her dagger through Tollin's chest, straight into the foul room burning beneath his ribcage. The pulpit erupted in blinding light. Tollin shrieked as the light consumed him from the inside out, his veins glowing, his skull cracking open. Maggots poured from his eye sockets, steaming in the holy fire. His last scream was not one of fear, but rapture. "I have seen the face of the gods." And then he was ash. Silence returned, broken only by the sobs of survivors and the low chant of Ellen as she completed the purification rite. Marcus surveyed the carnage. 20 dead, more wounded. Some had clawed at their own faces in panic. Others still sat in the pews, whispering the blasphemies they had heard. "It's spreading," he muttered. Ellen knelt beside a woman whose eyes had gone milky white. She rocked back and forth, humming the same phrase again and again. "Through ruin comes truth. Through ruin comes truth." Helen looked up at Marcus. Her face was hard now. "Then we stop it before the next sermon, because next time the whole city might be listening." Chapter 7. Visions of Flame. The night was thick with a suffocating heat that clung to the air like a living thing. Outside the walls of Dawnspire, the city of Hagendorf simmered under a moon drowned in crimson haze, a blood moon, the omens whispered in hushed tones among the desperate and the damned. Inside the temple's smallest chapel, lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle, Ellen Falkenberg knelt on the cold stone floor. Her hands trembled, clasped tightly around a tattered parchment, a letter hastily scrawled with shaky ink. The parchment was from a wandering celestial wizard, an exile fleeing the chaos that had begun to spread like a plague across the northern reaches of the Empire. The letter was a warning, a prayer, a prophecy. Ellen's lips moved silently, repeating the ancient words she had learned in secret, the prayers that called for clarity amidst the encroaching darkness. Suddenly the candles sputtered and flared, casting elongated shadows that danced like twisted demons on the walls. Her breath hitched as the room seemed to dissolve around her. The stones melted into molten rivers, the air thickened into a suffocating furnace, and she found herself standing amidst a burning battlefield. Flames clawed skyward, devouring twisted shapes that writhed in agony. The scent of scorched flesh and molten metal burned her nostrils. Through the haze, Ellen saw broken banners of the Empire, torn and stained with black blood, fluttering in a charnel wind. And then, through the flames he appeared, a figure cloaked in radiant white armor that glimmered even in the inferno. His face was obscured by a helm crowned with burning rays of light. In one hand he wielded a hammer that sang with celestial fury, its strikes shattering the bones of demonic beasts that lunged from the shadows. "Sigmar," the figure intoned, voice like thunder over a storm-tossed sea. "The light must not falter." But the vision twisted. The radiant hammer shattered, splintering into shards that rained down like deadly hail. The shining figure fell to his knees, the flames licking his armor, his cries swallowed by a rising tide of chaos. From the smoke, a voice whispered, soft, sinister, and filled with cold promise. The light fades. The age of ruin dawns. Ellen gasped, eyes snapping open. She was back in the chapel, sweat streaming down her face, heart pounding like a war drum. Marcus Velt stood over her, concern etched deep in his scarred features. "You cold?" She swallowed hard, clutching the letter tighter. "The north is burning, Marcus." The celestial wizard's last words, he spoke of an army forged in fire and shadow. Chaos is rising beyond the borders, and here, beneath our feet, it festers. Marcus knelt beside her, lowering his voice to a grim whisper. "We've seen its teeth already. The hammer, the sermons, the catacombs. If the corruption spreads unchecked, Dawnspire will be the spark that ignites the whole empire." Ellen's gaze hardened. "We must prepare, not just for the temple, but for the war to come. We need allies, warriors who can stand in the flames with us." Marcus's jaw tightened. "There's no time for doubt. We strike at the cult's heart before their poison takes root deeper." The candle flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken city, carrying the faintest echo of drums. Ritual drums beating a call to chaos, a summons to war. And in the depths of Dawnspire, something waited. Hungry, relentless, and see, the battle for the soul of the Empire had begun. Chapter 8. The Circle of Nine. The fog clung to the twisting alleys of Herr-Gundorf like a shroud, thick and suffocating, swallowing the weak light of tallow lamps and turning the city's stone walls into shadowed sentinels. Somewhere in the depths beneath the city, far from the sanctity of Dawnspire's sunlit spires, a hidden chamber breathed with malevolence. Its air was heavy with the stench of incense burned too long, a sickly sweet aroma tinged with decay and ash. Candles, black and twisted, flickered and cast grotesque shadows that writhed across the rough-hewn stone like living things. In the center of the chamber, a great iron-bound table, scarred with ancient runes and stained with centuries of blood, bore 9 seats. Around it, 9 figures gathered, each clad in dark, threadbare robes stitched with blasphemous sigils and each marked by a distinct, terrible token of their devotion. Verax the Whisperer sat at the head, his skin pale and taut, eyes burning with cold fire beneath a hood that never quite concealed the corruption crawling beneath his flesh. To his right, a woman with serpentine tattoos curling up her arms sharpened a wicked dagger etched with runes that pulsed like a living heart. To his left, a hulking brute with scarred flesh stretched tight over bulging muscles cracked his knuckles, the remnants of ritual scars bleeding a sickly black ichor. One by one, the others revealed themselves, each grotesque in their own way, each bearing the twisted marks of the ruinous powers they served. A thin, gaunt man with eyes too wide and teeth too sharp, whispering incessantly to unseen voices. A woman whose hair seemed woven from shadow itself, her fingertips adorned with nails longer than knives. A priest with one arm twisted and deformed, veins black as pitch pulsing beneath broken skin. A young acolyte, with a mouth sewn shut, yet silent prayers slipped through her clenched jaw like venom. A massive figure, silent except for the guttural growls that rumbled from deep within his chest. And finally, a pale youth whose eyes gleamed like stars trapped in ice, his face an unreadable mask of innocence and madness. Everett's voice, low and rasping, filled the chamber. "Brothers and sisters of the hidden gods, the hour approaches. Our work beneath Dawnspire has begun to bear fruit, but the time for shadows wanes. Soon, the veil will tear, and the Empire will choke on the rot we sow." He rose, his gaunt frame casting a long shadow across the stone. Each of you bears a fragment of the one true path. The ruinous powers grant us strength, but their desires diverge. Here, at this table, we bind our purpose." The woman with the dagger slit her blade across the table, drawing a line of dark blood that hissed and steamed. "I pledge myself to Slaanesh, mistress of ecstasy and pain. The flesh is the gateway, pleasure and torment will unravel their faith." The hulking brute slammed a fist into the table, the sound a thunderclap. "Corn demands blood and fire. The temple's walls will run red with the screams of the faithful." The thin man hissed, voice fracturing like shattered glass. "Nurgle's blessing is pestilence and decay. We will rot their bones and poison their hearts." The shadow-haired woman extended a hand, nails clicking like the ticking of a deadly clock. "Tzeentch weaves the strands of fate. Our plans will unfold beyond their sight." One by one, the members declared their allegiance and shared their dark gifts, blights, curses, illusions, and infernal pacts. Their powers intertwined, forming a tapestry of corruption, poised to engulf the temple and, ultimately, the Empire itself. Varrix's eyes gleamed. "Our enemies think to fight us with steel and prayers. But steel will shatter, and prayers will turn to screams. The circle of 9 is eternal, unbreakable." He raised a clawed hand, black blood dripping from his fingertips. "Prepare yourselves. The next phase begins tonight." From the shadows, the chamber's walls pulsed with a sickly light as a portal shimmered open, an abyssal maw bleeding unholy energy into the mortal realm. As the cultists stepped forward, shadows stretched and twisted, seeping like ink across the city's soul. Below the city's proud towers and golden halls, the true war for Dawnspire was gathering its terrible strength, and it would not be denied. Chapter 9. Whispers in the Sanctuary. The sacred sanctuary of Dawnspire, once a sanctuary of radiant hope, now throbbed with a sinister pulse. The grand chamber, lined with towering columns carved in the likeness of Sigmar's divine heralds, was suffused with an unnatural gloom. Light filtered through the stained glass windows, but the colors were twisted, crimson bleeding into sickly green, gold into ash gray, casting an eerie pallor over the rows of trembling worshippers. The air was thick and heavy, as if soaked in a miasma of despair and deceit. The scent of incense had curdled into something fouler, an acrid, cloying stench of rot and sulfur that clung to the tongue like poison. A subtle vibration rippled beneath the stone floor, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to set the congregation's nerves on edge. A low hum rose from the altar, faint but persistent, like the buzzing of 1,000 unseen insects trapped behind the walls. At the center of the sanctuary stood Brother Malus, newly elevated to the role of preacher in the wake of the fallen high priest. His white robes, once pristine, were stained with grime and blotched with dark, spreading patches that no amount of scrubbing could remove. His eyes, wide and glassy, darted nervously as he lifted the ancient tome of Sigmar's sermons. He opened the book, but the words seemed to writhe on the pages, their ink bleeding and twisting into indecipherable shapes. Malus's voice cracked as he began to read, but the words that escaped his lips were not the prayers of the Empire. They were twisted, blasphemous incantations, laced with venom and madness. "The light falters," he intoned, voice trembling yet compelling. "In darkness, truth reveals itself. The flesh is the temple, and the temple shall burn." Gasps swept through the congregation. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Priests exchanged fearful glances. The faithful trembled. Ellen Falkenberg stood at the edge of the pews, her heart pounding. She clutched her dagger beneath her cloak, the silver blade catching the dim light like a shard of moon. She stepped forward, voice cutting through the murmurs. "Brother Malus, cease this heresy at once." Malus's head snapped up, eyes blazing with a mad fervor. "The heresy is truth, sister. The old ways crumble and the new dawn rises from the ashes of faith." Suddenly Melis's hands convulsed, veins blackening and twisting beneath the skin. A dark aura spilled from his fingertips, tendrils of shadow curling around the altar. The stone cracked and fractured, black ichor seeping from the fissures. Screams erupted as the congregation fled toward the exits, trampling over one another. Some collapsed, writhing as unseen horrors whispered terrible secrets in their ears. Ellen lunged toward Melis, but he spun, revealing a grotesque transformation, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, teeth jagged and glinting like broken glass. From his throat spilled a torrent of thick black bile that hissed and burned the marble floor. She dodged the corrosive spray, plunging her dagger into his chest. The silver blade pierced flesh and bone, but Melis did not falter. Instead, he let out a guttural roar, his body convulsing violently. A swarm of spectral flies erupted from his torn flesh, buzzing and biting at all who remained. Marcus Velth appeared beside Ellen, swinging his sword in wide arcs that cleaved through the swarm. Yet more continued to pour from Melis' wounds. Ellen grabbed a vial of holy water from her belt, flinging it over Melis's head. The liquid hissed on contact, burning through his skin and smoke rising from the wound. With a final, unearthly scream, Melis collapsed, his form dissolving into a pile of ash and writhing maggots. The sanctuary fell deathly silent. The shattered altar oozed blackness, a pulsating heart of corruption nestled within the sacred stone. Ellen's eyes burned with fury and dread. "We're losing this battle," she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly, sheathing his bloodied sword. "But we will fight." The whispers in the sanctuary had become a roar, and the corruption would not stop until the light was extinguished. Chapter 10. The Blade of Benediction. The cavernous armory beneath Dawnspire was cold as a tomb, its walls slick with condensation and the faint rustle of forgotten memories. Rows of weapons hung in silent vigil, gleaming hammers, broadswords etched with ancient runes, shields worn by generations of temple warriors. But amid these relics of faith and war, one artifact held a secret that pulsed beneath the cold steel. Ellen Falkenberg stepped cautiously through the shadowed vault, the faint clink of her boots against the stone echoing like distant thunder. Her breath formed small clouds in the chill air. Beside her, Captain Marcus Velth moved with practiced silence, his war-worn eyes scanning the gloom for threats unseen. They were drawn here not by hope but by desperation. Physicians' fingers brushed over the hilts of swords and axes, the echoes of their bearers whispering of battles long past. And then, near the far wall, she saw it, a narrow alcove hidden behind tattered banners. There, resting on a pedestal of black marble, lay the Blade of Benediction. The sword seemed almost to glow with an inner light, its silver blade etched with sigils of Sigmar that shimmered faintly in the darkness. The crossguard was fashioned like outstretched wings, and the pommel bore the image of a roaring lion, the symbol of unyielding courage. Ellen's heart quickened. "The Blade of Benediction," she whispered. "It's said to burn with the light of the heavens, to glow in the presence of corruption." Marcus nodded, his voice low. "If what's creeping through this temple is true, and I believe it is, then this sword might be our only weapon against it." Ellen reached out, fingers trembling, and lifted the blade from its resting place. The air seemed to hum with power as the sword came free, its weight familiar and comforting. Suddenly a chill ran down her spine. The shadows around them thickened, writhing like smoke, alive with malice. From the darkness emerged a figure, one of the cultists, eyes glowing with unholy fire, blade drawn and twisted with cruel barbs. Marcus reacted instantly, stepping between Ellen and the attacker. Steel met steel and a shower of sparks. The cultist's blade slashed, aiming for Marcus's throat, but the captain parried, countering with a savage blow that sent the assailant staggering back. The fight was brutal and close, the sounds of clashing steel ringing like thunder. Ellen gripped the blade of Benediction tighter, feeling its warmth surge through her veins. With a cry to Sigmar, she lunged forward, the sword singing as it cleaved through the cultist's defenses. The blade found its mark beneath the ribs, slicing clean through muscle and bone. The cultist let out a strangled scream, blood spurting in a dark arc, as he collapsed to the cold stone floor. The shadows recoiled, hissed, and then vanished like smoke in a breeze. Marcus wiped his blade clean on the fallen cultist's robes, breathing heavily. It was too close, he muttered. Ellen looked down at the blade of Benediction, its silver edge stained with blood, yet still glowing with pure light. "This sword is more than a weapon," she said softly. "It's a beacon, a promise that even in the darkest depths of corruption, the light of Sigmar would never be snuffed out. And with that light, they might yet reclaim Dawnspire." Chapter 11. Sacrificial Rites. The air beneath Dawnspire thickened, heavy with the sickly scent of blood and burning resin. Deep in the forgotten catacombs where the stone walls wept moisture, and the silence was broken only by distant dripping, the cultists gathered for their darkest ritual yet. The flickering torchlight cast monstrous shadows that danced like demons on the cracked walls, while the air trembled with a sinister pulse that clawed at the soul. In a vast chamber carved from ancient granite, the floor bore a massive pentagram, traced in fresh blood, a circle of runes and symbols so profane that the very stones seemed to recoil from their touch. At the center, a raised altar stained black with age and sacrifice stood waiting. Varax the Whisperer emerged from the gloom, robes flowing like a living shadow. His eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he raised a chalice filled with a thick, crimson liquid that shimmered with unnatural light, the blood of the faithful, harvested from their fallen brethren. Around the altar knelt 9 cultists, the circle of 9, each adorned in garb twisted by their patron ruinous powers, chanting in a discordant chorus that echoed through the chamber like the howling of damned souls. The air grew electric, crackling with raw, malevolent energy as Varax intoned words lost to sane memory. "By blood we bind, by bone we break, by flesh we open the gate. Ruin and wrath, disease and flame, hear our call, unleash the daemon's name." The cultist voices rose, a crescendo of blasphemy and madness. Tendrils of shadow spilled from the walls, coiling around the altar like serpents, eager to devour. The air thickened until it was nearly solid, a choking fog of corruption and despair. From a concealed alcove, 2 of Varax's most trusted disciples dragged forward a bound figure, the temple's youngest acolyte, her eyes wide with terror, mouth gagged with strips of bloodied cloth. Her skin was pale, veins darkened and pulsing beneath as if something rotted within. Varax smiled, a slow, venomous curve of lips. "This lamb is offered to the gods of ruin. Through her the demon shall be born." He lifted the chalice, spilling its blood onto the acolyte's trembling hands, binding her to the unholy pact. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the altar began to pulse, heartbeats thudding through stone, a heartbeat not her own. Suddenly, Ellen Falkenberg and Marcus Velt burst through the archway, steel drawn and eyes blazing with fury. "For Sigmar!" Marcus roared, cleaving through a cultist's neck in a spray of blood and sinew. The chamber erupted into chaos. Blades clashed with rusted daggers, dark magic spat like venom. Ellen darted forward, driving the blade of Benediction through the arm of a cultist who shrieked in pain as silver fire seared his corrupted flesh. Barak snarled, raising his hands as a seething mass of shadow coalesced behind the altar, a demon bound in chains of blood and flame, its many eyes blazing with hatred and hunger. The acolyte's body convulsed violently as the demon's essence began to pour into her, twisting her from within. Her screams tore through the chamber, a symphony of agony and blasphemy. Ellen lunged, slashing the bindings with a cry of desperation. Chains shattered, and the demon roared, claws ripping through stone as it surged forward, an immense writhing beast of shadow and flame. Marcus met it head-on, steel ringing against claws sharp as razors. He slashed deep, blood spraying in great arcs, but the demon's flesh was like molten rock, scorching and impervious. Ellen focused, chanting the sacred rites taught by the ancient priests. The blade of Benediction flared with blinding light, striking the demon's eyes. It howled, staggering back. Seizing the moment, Marcus plunged his sword into the demon's heart, twisting with all his might. The creature shuddered, shrieked, and exploded into a storm of shadow and embers. Silence fell. The acolyte collapsed, free but broken, eyes glazed with pain and terror. Ellen dropped to her knees, breathing hard, the weight of what they'd just stopped pressing down on her like a grave. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. "The darkness knows no mercy. Neither can we." Chapter 12. Flames of Reprisal. The night air outside Dawnspire hung heavy with smoke and ash, the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh clawing at the lungs like a living thing. The city's distant cries, shouts of alarm, the screams of the innocent, and the clash of steel were swallowed by the heavy veil of darkness that now shrouded the temple. Within the shattered walls of the western wing a battle raged, a desperate clash of blood and faith, where every breath was a struggle, and every heartbeat a gamble with death. Ellen Falkenberg stood at the heart of the storm, the blade of Benediction clenched tightly in her hands, its silver edge slick with the ichor of fallen cultists. Her robes were torn and stained, hair matted with sweat and grime. Her eyes burned not just with fatigue, but with an unyielding resolve. Beside her, Captain Marcus Velt fought like a man possessed, his sword a whirlwind of death as he cut through the cultists who had infiltrated the temple's defenses. Each swing sent arcs of crimson into the cold stone, a brutal symphony of violence that echoed through the hall. The cultists came in waves, feral, desperate, and unrelenting. Their twisted forms moved with unnatural speed, their faces masks of madness and devotion. Some wielded jagged blades smeared with poisons that hissed upon contact with flesh. Others bore wicked claws that shredded armor as if it were parchment. One cultist lunged at Ellen, teeth bared in a snarl, slashing wildly with a serrated dagger. She sidestepped just in time, the blade slicing through her sleeve and drawing a burning line of blood. She spun, driving the Benediction deep into the cultist's ribs. The man screamed, a ragged, guttural sound as he collapsed, convulsing in death. Nearby, Marcus grappled with a hulking brute whose skin was cracked and oozed black ichor. The cultist's fist slammed into Marcus's jaw, sending him staggering against the wall. Blood spilled from his split lip, but he recovered quickly, driving his blade upward into the cultist's throat. The cultist gurgled, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in a heap. Flames erupted suddenly in the corner of the chamber. A torch hurled by a cultist ignited a stack of oil-soaked banners. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking at wooden beams and sacred tapestries. Smoke curled, thick and choking, filling the air with a suffocating haze. Isolde, battered but unbroken, shouted orders, rallying the loyalists to push the cultists back. She swung her mace with brutal efficiency, smashing skulls and shattering bones, each strike fueled by fury and desperation. Ellen's voice rang out over the chaos. "To the inner sanctum, we cannot let them reach the relics." The loyalists rallied, forming a shield wall as they advanced through the burning corridors. Cultists fell beneath their blades, their screams drowned by the roar of flame and the pounding of desperate feet. At the threshold of the inner sanctum, a cult leader, a pale woman with eyes like burning coals, stood waiting, a twisted staff crackling with dark energy. She raised the weapon, unleashing a blast of searing shadow that slammed into the front line, sending warriors flying like rag dolls. Ellen met the woman's gaze, steel flashing. The two clashed in a violent dance of blade and sorcery, light against shadow. The cultist spells burned and clawed, but the Benediction's light was pure and relentless. Ellen pressed forward, parrying a blast of dark fire before plunging her blade through the cultist's heart. The woman's scream was a ragged, inhuman sound as she crumpled, dissolving into a cloud of black ash. Silence fell, brief and fragile. The flames still consumed the outer walls, smoke billowed through shattered windows, and the scent of blood and fire mingled in the air. But Dawnspire's defenders had held. Breathing heavily, Ellen sheathed her sword and looked toward the sanctum's sealed doors. The battle was far from over, but for tonight the temple still stood, and the light of Sigmar, though flickering, had not been extinguished. Chapter 13. Revelation of the Fallen. The morning after the battle, Dawnspire was a husk of its former glory. The once pristine marble floors were stained with blood and ash. Shattered stained glass littered the nave like a shattered kaleidoscope. The air was thick with the acrid tang of smoke and the metallic bite of iron, mixing with the muted sobs of the survivors. Errol Falkenberg moved through the ruined temple like a wraith, her robes torn and smeared with grime and gore. Her eyes, sharp and burning with purpose, scanned every shadow, every face. The temple was scarred, but worse yet was the poison that festered within the hearts of those sworn to its protection. In the dim light of the vestry, she stood face to face with the man she once trusted, Brother Lorik. His robes hung loosely on his gaunt frame, the emblem of Sigmar burned off his chest as if seared by infernal flame. His pale face was drawn and hollow, eyes dull yet flickering with unnatural intensity. He held a crimson-stained dagger, loosely in one trembling hand. Marcus Velt stood behind Ellen, sword ready, muscles taut with suspicion. "Ellen," Lorik croaked, voice ragged, "you must understand. It is the only way." Ellen's heart clenched with betrayal. "Lorik, how? You fought alongside us. Why?" Lorik's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "The faith we cling to is broken, sister. The gods we serve are chains. I have seen the truth beyond the veil. The ruinous powers offer freedom, the strength to remake the world anew." He raised the dagger, the blade glinting wickedly. "Join us, or fall with the rest." Marcus lunged forward, but Ellen raised a hand. His eyes burned bright as coals. "Do you think your sword can save you? You cannot fight the truth." Suddenly, a harsh cry rang out from the doorway. It was Sister Isolde, pale and shaking, clutching a bloodied scrap of fabric, Lorik's cloak torn and soaked. "He's been sabotaging us," she gasped. "Feeding the cult information. They knew our moves before we made them." Ellen's gaze sharpened. "You betrayed us," she whispered, voice cold as steel. Lorik laughed, a sound cracked and hollow. "Betrayal is perspective. I am a servant of the future." With a sudden, violent surge, he lunged, dagger slashing toward Ellen's throat. She twisted aside, dagger flashing in her hand as she parried and countered, steel ringing against steel in the claustrophobic room. Marcus joined the fray, striking Lorik's ribs with brutal force. Blood spattered the floor as the cultist staggered back. Pain etched across his face. But Lorik was swift, his movements unnatural, fueled by dark power. He slashed again, catching Marcus's arm, tearing flesh and muscle. Marcus growled, swinging his sword in a wide arc that cleaved into Loric's shoulder. Loric screamed, stumbling to the floor. Ellen pressed her dagger to his throat. "Your treachery ends here." Loric's eyes fluttered, then closed. The room fell silent, but for the ragged breathing of the survivors. Aelin looked at Marcus, voice resolute. "The corruption runs deeper than we feared. We must root it out no matter the cost." Outside, the sun struggled to pierce the smoke, casting long, uncertain shadows over Dawnspire's battered stone. The temple's salvation, or its doom, now rested on the fragile edge of their choices. Chapter 14. The Cleansing Pyre. The scent of burning flesh and sacred timber clung to the air like a plague, suffocating and thick. The once glorious western wing of Dawnspire was a ruinous cathedral of fire and despair. Flames licked hungrily at splintered beams and torn tapestries, casting grotesque shadows that danced like specters across the cracked marble floors. The heat was unbearable, a furnace that seemed to boil the very souls of those who dared remain. Ellen Falkenberg moved through the chaos like a wraith, her robes singed and heavy with soot. Her face was streaked with ash, and streaked tears, eyes blazing with relentless fury. Beside her, Captain Marcus Velt wielded his sword with brutal precision, carving a path through the last remnants of the cultists who clung desperately to the burning halls. The cultists fought with reckless abandon, their madness and desperation fueling savage attacks. One of them, a gaunt man with eyes like molten gold and a grin twisted by pain, slashed wildly at Marcus, his blade cutting deep into the captain's side. Blood poured forth in a dark torrent, soaking the stone beneath. Marcus growled, deflecting another blow before driving his sword deep into the cultist's throat. The man gurgled, his eyes rolling back as he crumpled in a heap, lifeblood pouring like a river onto the pyres. Ellen's dagger flashed as she intercepted a wiry cultist, slitting his throat with surgical precision. The man's blood sprayed the air, a crimson mist that smelled of iron and death. They reached the heart of the conflagration, the inner sanctum now engulfed in flames that roared like a living beast. The altar, once a beacon of purity, was twisted and blackened, soaked with the ichor of dark rites. A figure knelt before it, Verax the Whisperer. His robes were scorched and torn, skin blistered from the inferno, but his eyes burned with unyielding madness. In his hands he cradled a relic, a fragment of the sacred Sigmar's light, now corrupted, pulsing with unholy energy. "Your faith is ashes," Verax hissed, voice cracking like fire. "From these ashes a new order will rise." Eileen lunged forward, blade raised. Verax met her charge, summoning a swirling vortex of shadow and flame that whipped through the chamber, scorching flesh and stone alike. Ellen was thrown back, her body slamming into the altar with sickening force. Marcus roared, charging Verax with a battle cry, steel striking against dark magic in a clash that shook the very foundations of the temple. The two titans battled amidst the inferno, Marcus's blade glowing with holy light, Verax's shadowy spells twisting the air into nightmarish shapes. Sparks flew, flesh was scorched, and blood spilled freely. Helen struggled to her feet, determination hardening her gaze. She plunged the blade of Benediction into the corrupted relic, the sword's holy light flaring like a sunburst. The altar trembled, cracks spreading like lightning through the stone. Verret screamed, a sound of rage and agony, as the dark power shattered and the flames surged higher, consuming him in a pillar of purifying fire. The chamber shook violently as the roof groaned and cracked. Marcus grabbed Ellen's arm. Time to go. They fled through choking smoke and collapsing beams, the temple groaning in death throes around them. Outside, the rain began to fall. Cold, cleansing, washing away the blackened scars of the night. The cultists were defeated. For now. But the price had been steep. The temple lay in ruins, and Dawnspire's dawn was stained forever by fire and blood. Chapter 15. Heart of the Spire. The air grew colder as Ellen Falkenberg and her battered band descended deeper beneath Dawnspire, into the very heart of the temple's sacred foundation. The stone steps spiraled downward in a dizzying descent, slick with damp and littered with fragments of bone and shattered relics. Every breath they drew tasted of dust, rot, and something far darker, an ancient corruption seeping slowly through the very veins of the city. At the bottom lay the vault of the First Light, a chamber said to house Sigmar's greatest treasure, the relic known simply as Sigmar's Light. It was no ordinary artifact, forged in the fires of the heavens and blessed by the first high priest himself. It was said to hold the essence of the god's will, a beacon of hope against the gathering darkness. But as Ellen approached, the air thickened with malevolence. The vault's massive stone doors hung cracked and broken, their sacred wards shattered by unknown hands. Inside, the chamber was a desecrated nightmare. The walls, once gleaming with gold leaf and holy scripture, were scorched and clawed by dark runes that pulsed with sickly green light. The floor was littered with the charred remains of once proud warriors, bodies twisted in agony, their eyes wide with silent screams. The acrid stench of burnt flesh and decayed incense choked the air. At the center, atop a pedestal carved from obsidian, rested Sigmar's Light, but it was no longer a source of purity. The relic pulsed with a dark aura, black tendrils of smoke weaving from its core like living shadow, corrupting the very light around it. Verex the Whisperer stood before it, his face a twisted mask of triumph and madness. His robes hung ragged and stained, eyes gleaming with unnatural fire. In his hands he held a dagger etched with unholy symbols, its blade dripping with fresh blood. "You see, priestess," he whispered, voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "This is no mere relic. It is the key, the gateway, and soon it will be the conduit through which our true Lord descends." Ellen gripped the blade of Benediction, its silver edge flickering with holy light that pushed back the shadows at her feet. "We will stop you," she vowed, voice steel and fire. Barracks laughed, a sound like shattered glass. "Stop me? You stand before the dawn of ruin itself." He lunged, dagger flashing in a blur. Ellen parried, sparks flying as silver met unholy steel. The clash rang like thunder in the vault's vaulted chamber. Marcus Velt charged from the side, his greatsword swinging in a deadly arc that caught Verac's shoulder. Black blood welled from the wound, sizzling where it touched the ground. Verac snarled and unleashed a torrent of shadow, tendrils writhing like serpents toward Ellen. She dodged, slicing through them with the Benediction's light, each cut releasing a burst of pure flame that singed flesh and bone. The battle raged, a dance of fire and shadow beneath the vaulted ceilings. The relic pulsed faster, reacting to the chaos like a beating heart. Verex's voice grew frantic. "You cannot stop the coming tide." With a final desperate scream, he drove his dagger into the pedestal, the runes flaring with unholy fire. The vault shook violently. Stone cracked. The corrupted relic exploded in a storm of darkness and flame, tendrils shooting out like living knives. Ellen dove forward, blade raised, slicing through the writhing shadows to seize the shattered heart of the relic. It was warm, alive, humming with terrible power. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The shadows screamed and withered. Light blossomed, but at a cost. From the darkness emerged a shriek that froze the blood. Verex, wounded but unbroken, limped back, dragging with him a demon bound in chains of black iron, its eyes burning with eternal hunger. The true battle for Dawnspire's soul was only just beginning. Chapter 16. Dreams of a Broken Empire. The chamber beneath the vault of the First Light was suffused with a choking darkness that pressed down like a living weight. Flickering torches lined the walls, their flames guttering against an unseen wind that carried whispers, fragments of mad prayers and cruel promises. The air tasted of ash and despair, heavy with the residue of ancient curses. Ellen Falkenberg knelt on the cold stone floor, clutching the shattered remnants of Sigmar's light. Her hands trembled, the holy shards pulsing faintly with an unstable glow, as if the relic itself struggled between salvation and corruption. Opposite her, Verax the Whisperer sat shackled to a rune-inscribed pillar, his gaunt face twisted in fury and desperation. Dark bruises bloomed beneath his pale skin, the chains searing into flesh and soul alike. Yet his eyes burned with unyielding madness. "You think you've won?" Verax spat, voice raw with venom. "This relic is not the end, priestess. It is the beginning. The dawning of an age where the Empire will crumble beneath the weight of its own lies." Ellen's gaze was steady, her voice calm but fierce. "I do not fear your darkness, Verax. Your gods are broken shards of chaos, fragments of ruin. The light of Sigmar is eternal." Verax laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "Eternal? Look around you." He gestured broadly to the shattered temple, the bloodied corpses, the scattered survivors. "This is your holy empire, a carcass riddled with rot. The fools who worship Sigmar cling to ghosts, while the real power rises beneath their feet." Ellen's jaw tightened. "And you think this is power?" she demanded. "Your blasphemy will bring only destruction." "Destruction is rebirth," Verax hissed. "The old gods must fall to make way for the new. The ruinous powers whisper their promises to those brave enough to listen. I hear them." Suddenly his voice dropped, a whisper laced with fevered intensity. "I have seen the visions, the ruin and fire that will consume the Empire. Cities burning, blood rivers flooding the streets, fathers turned upon sons, brothers spilling each other's blood, all beneath the blackened sky of a dying world." Ellen's heart pounded. She knew the truth in his words, the terrifying inevitability of war and ruin that stalked the land like a ravenous beast. But she also saw the path forward. A crack of light flickered in the shattered shards of Sigmar's light. She pressed her palms against the relic, willing its power to surge. Verax screamed, struggling against his bonds as a blinding radiance erupted from the holy fragments. The darkness recoiled. Ellen rose, blade shimmering with renewed purpose. "This temple, this city, this empire, they will stand. Not because we are perfect, but because we fight for the light, even in the darkest times." Verax snarled, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You are nothing but a candle flickering against the storm, priestess. And yet, even a candle can banish the night." As the chamber filled with radiant light, Ellen knew the war was far from over. But the dream of a broken empire could still be mended, one righteous strike at a time. Chapter 17. The Battle of the Blooded Altar. The air within the ruined sanctum of Dawnspire crackled with dark energy, thick enough to taste, a bitter blend of sulfur and burnt flesh that clung to every breath. The walls, once adorned with angelic frescoes and gilded reliefs, were now scarred and shattered, stained deep with blood and ichor that seemed to pulse as if alive. At the heart of the chamber lay the blooded altar, a grotesque monument carved from obsidian and spattered with fresh gore, its surface etched with blasphemous runes glowing faintly in sickly green. It was the battlefield upon which the fate of Dawnspire, and perhaps the Empire itself, would be decided. Ellen Falkenberg stood before it, her robes torn, face streaked with grime and dried blood. The blade of Benediction in her hand gleamed with fierce, pure light, cutting through the oppressive shadows like a shard of dawn breaking a night of endless terror. Her breath came ragged, her muscles burning, but her spirit was unbroken. Across from her, the circle of 9 gathered like a nightmare made flesh, 9 twisted figures, each bearing the horrific marks of their dark patrons, their eyes glowing with cruel anticipation. Varax the Whisperer, his flesh blistered and cracked from previous battles, stood at their center, wielding a staff that writhed with demonic energy. The cultists' voices rose in a horrid chorus, chanting incantations that bent reality itself. The air shimmered, distorting with maddening illusions. Shadows turned to snarling beasts. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and writhe, and from the altar surged tendrils of darkness that lashed like serpents. With a battle cry that tore through the chaos, Marcus Velt charged forward, sword held high. His blade crashed against a cultist's jagged dagger in a shower of sparks. The cultist snarled, slashing wildly, drawing deep crimson from Marcus's arm, but the captain gritted his teeth, driving his sword through the attacker's throat with brutal finality. Ellen moved with lethal grace, slicing through the crowd as the blade of Benediction radiated holy fire that seared corrupted flesh. One cultist lunged, claws extended. She ducked beneath the attack and drove her blade through his heart. He convulsed, eyes rolling back, before collapsing into a heap of twitching limbs. He raised his staff, calling forth a storm of shadow and flame. Dark fire roared and spiraled, scorching the air and melting stone. The cultists advanced behind the whirlwind, their faces twisted in ecstasy and madness. Ellen and Marcus fought back to back, a whirlwind of steel and light. Marcus's sword sang as it cleaved through armored flesh, while Ellen's Benediction flared, each strike purifying the corrupt. Blood sprayed and mingled with sweat. The scent of death was overwhelming. Suddenly, Varax unleashed a terrifying howl that shattered the air, summoning a demon, massive, hulking, with eyes like burning coals and claws that could rend the world. It crashed into the battlefield, shattering stone and bone alike. Marcus met the demon's charge, his blade ringing as it struck the monstrous flesh. He slashed deep, but the creature's hide was like molten rock, searing and impervious. The demon swiped, catching Marcus and sending him crashing against the altar with a sickening crack. Ellen screamed, rushing to his side, but Varax intercepted her, his staff striking like lightning. She staggered, blood blossoming across her robes. Pain surged, but she clenched her teeth and raised the Benediction high. The sword blazed with divine fury as she plunged it into Varax's chest. He howled, dark blood spattering the ground, but he grasped her wrist, wrenching the blade aside and driving a poisoned dagger into her thigh. Ellen fell, burning agony radiating through her leg, but her grip on the Benediction never faltered. Marcus struggled to his feet, blood dripping from a broken nose, and together they drove the cultists back. The demon roared, but Ellen's light blazed brighter, searing its eyes. It staggered, faltered. With a final, desperate strike, Marcus plunged his sword into the demon's heart. It screamed, collapsing into a heap of smoldering ash. The cultists fled, their dark prayers drowned by the storm of steel and fire. Silence fell over the blooded altar. Ellen and Marcus stood amidst the ruin, breathing heavily, wounded but victorious. The temple's soul was scarred, torn and bleeding, but not yet broken. The battle for Dawnspire had been won, but the war for the Empire's very heart had only just begun. Chapter 18. Martyr's Light. The shattered halls of Dawnspire groaned beneath the weight of ruin. The air was thick with choking smoke and the coppery scent of fresh blood. The flickering torchlight cast grotesque dancing shadows on the cracked walls, illuminating the scattered bodies of fallen warriors, both loyalists and cultists alike, strewn across the cold stone like broken statues. Captain Marcus Velt knelt beside the shattered altar, his armor battered and stained crimson. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a ragged rasp as blood seeped from a deep gash across his abdomen. His hand, slick with gore, trembled as it gripped the hilt of his sword, now dulled by the relentless carnage. Ellen Falkenberg stood nearby, her own robes torn and sodden, eyes wild with desperation and fire. Her dagger, dipped in sanctified oil, gleamed faintly in the dim light. Around her, the survivors gathered, wounded, shaken, but unbroken. Suddenly a deafening roar echoed from the depths of the temple, a monstrous growl that shook the stones and sent a shiver through every soul present. A demon, the last vestige of the cult's unholy summons, burst forth from the shadows. Towering and grotesque, its flesh seemed to ripple with burning embers, claws like molten blades rending the air with savage fury. Its many eyes burned with unholy hunger, seeking the final spark of resistance. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, despite the agony that tore through his body. Blood poured freely from his wounds, staining the floor in dark rivulets. "This ends now," he growled. He charged, steel flashing in a deadly arc that cleaved through the daemon's forearm, eliciting a howl of fury and pain. The creature swung back with devastating force, catching Marcus across the chest and hurling him into the altar with a sickening crack. The captain collapsed, breath escaping in a wet cough, his body broken but his will unyielding. Ellen's eyes blazed. She stepped forward, chanting a prayer taught in secret by the old priests. Her voice was steady, commanding as she raised the blade of Benediction high. The sword flared with brilliant light, pure and unyielding, a beacon amid the darkness. Ellen rushed at the demon, the blade singing as it struck true, piercing the creature's glowing eye. The demon screamed, a terrible guttural sound that shattered stone and shook the air. With trembling hands, Ellen plunged the benediction deep into the daemon's chest. Light burst forth, searing through corrupted flesh, burning and purifying. The demon convulsed violently, claws flailing wildly before it collapsed into a smoldering heap of ash and embers. Marcus struggled to rise, blood dripping from his lips, his gaze meeting Ellen's with fierce gratitude. "Go," he rasped, voice hoarse. "Finish this without me." Ellen shook her head, tears mingling with sweat. "No, we finish this together." But Marcus smiled, pain etched deep into his features. "Not this time. The temple needs you, now." With a final, ragged breath, Marcus sank to his knees, clutching the broken altar as his strength ebbed away. Ellen knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his brow. "Your sacrifice will not be forgotten," she whispered. Around them, the surviving faithful gathered, their voices rising in a solemn chant, a prayer to Sigmar for the fallen and the living. The light of the blade of Benediction shimmered, a lone flame against the gathering darkness, and as Marcus's eyes closed, the temple seemed to breathe, a fragile promise that even in death, hope endured. Chapter 19. The Harbinger's Fall. The vault of the First Light was no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield drenched in shadow and blood. The thick, choking haze of corruption lingered like a living thing, twisting and writhing against the desperate blaze of Ellen Falkenberg's blade of Benediction. Each step she took echoed with purpose, the weight of countless sacrifices heavy upon her soul. Before her stood Varax the Whisperer, the architect of Dawnspire's ruin and the harbinger of the coming darkness. His body was ravaged, flesh cracked and blistered from the battles fought and the infernal energies he wielded. Yet his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding madness, bright embers of chaos refusing to be extinguished. "Did you truly believe your faith could withstand the storm?" Varax hissed, voice like grinding stone. "I am the reckoning, the decay that will crumble your empire." Ellen's grip on the Benediction tightened until her knuckles whitened. "You are the ruin you worship?" The air thickened as Varax summoned a maelstrom of shadow, snakes of darkness weaving and coiling, seeking to crush and consume. They lash outward, swift and lethal. Ellen raised the blade of Benediction, its holy light flaring in a radiant burst that cleaved through the shadows like a beacon. The serpentine shadows screamed as they were torn apart, fading like smoke in the wind. Varax snarled, his lips peeling back to reveal jagged teeth. With a guttural cry, he surged forward, dagger flashing, a blur of malevolent intent. Steel met steel in a violent clash, sparks flying as Benediction parried the blow, then sliced deep into Varax's side. Black blood welled from the wound, steaming where it touched the floor. Varax faltered, but his rage only deepened. He struck again, faster and fiercer, each blow threatening to overwhelm. Ellen danced on the edge of exhaustion, pain radiating from her battered limbs and seared flesh, yet her spirit burned brighter than ever. A sudden roar split the air. Marcus Velt, battered and bloodied, emerged from the shadows, sword raised high. "Held me, Elaine," he bellowed, charging into the fray. Together they fought, a tempest of steel and light against shadow and ruin. Marcus's blade struck true, slashing at Varax's legs, forcing the cultist to stagger. Ellen pressed the advantage, driving Benediction through Varax's chest. The demon's eyes widened in shock and fury. He screamed, a sound that cracked stone and shattered silence. Varax's body convulsed violently as radiant light poured from the wound, burning away corruption like wildfire. The shadows clung desperately but were torn apart by the surge of purity. With one final agonized cry, Varax collapsed, his twisted form dissolving into ash and dust that scattered on the cold stone floor. Silence settled like a shroud. Ellen sank to her knees, breathing ragged, the weight of the battle pressing down upon her. Marcus lowered his sword, blood dripping from its edge, his eyes reflecting grim relief. The vault was cleansed, the corrupted relics shattered, but the scars left behind, on the temple, the city, and their souls, would linger forever. And as the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the cracked walls, Ellen knew this victory was but a single step in a far longer journey. The war for the Empire's soul was far from over. Chapter 20. Ashes and Dawnlight. The first rays of dawn struggled to pierce the thick veil of smoke that still clung to the battered city of Hargendorf. Dawnspire, once a gleaming beacon of faith and power, now stood as a broken skeleton, its shattered spires silhouetted against a pale, blood-tinted sky. The streets below were silent but for the distant moans of the wounded and the crackling of dying fires, smoldering like the last breaths of a fallen giant. Ellen Falkenberg walked through the ruins of the temple, her footsteps echoing on the cracked marble floor. Her robes hung heavy with soot and blood, her face gaunt and lined with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with a fierce resolve. Around her the survivors, scarred warriors, trembling priests, and shattered acolytes, moved with slow, heavy steps, tending to the wounded and clearing the debris of destruction. The scent of charred wood and spilled blood mingled with the faint, sweet fragrance of incense struggling to burn in shattered censers. Statues of saints and angels, toppled and broken, lay scattered like fallen heroes, their faces worn smooth by flame and time. Ellen paused before the shattered altar where the blade of Benediction rested, its silver edge dulled but still radiant with a soft, enduring light. She knelt and pressed her palm to the cold stone, whispering a prayer to Sigmar, a vow that this temple, this city, and this empire would not fall to darkness. From behind her, the voice of Marcus Velt broke the silence, rough and tired. "We've won the battle, but the war is far from over." Ellen nodded slowly. She had seen the corruption's tendrils stretch beyond the temple walls. Whispers in the taverns, shadows lurking in the city's underbelly, and rumors of chaos cults rising elsewhere in the Empire's borderlands. But for now, there was a fragile peace, a time to heal, a time to remember. She rose, looking out over the city as dawn's light spilled over the horizon, turning the ashes to gold. The destruction was immense, but so too was the hope that flickered like a candle in the dark. Ellen knew she would leave Hagendorf soon, become a wandering priestess, a guardian of light and a warning against unseen heresies. But this place, this temple, would forever hold a part of her soul. As the city began to stir, tentative and wary, Ellen lifted her gaze to the heavens, whispering one final prayer. "May Sigmar's light guide us through the darkest night." And with that, the broken dawn gave way to the promise of a new day.